There is a version of you that already died the day you learned too much about people, about the world, about how things really work. You call it growing up. One philosopher called it something else. He called it the thing that kills a mind slowly, without it ever noticing. And the cure he found wasn't more knowledge, it was less. Tonight, you'll find out why, and why he couldn't save himself with it. Turin, Italy, January 3rd, 1889. A 44-year-old man walks out of a rented room on Via Carlo Alberto. He is alone. He has always been alone. No wife, no children, almost no friends left, a body that has been failing him for 2 decades. Migraines so severe he was sometimes blind for days. A stomach that could barely hold food. Eyes that could barely read. Weeks earlier, in that same small room, he finished what he believed was the most important work of his life, and almost nobody had read it. One of his earlier books had sold a few hundred copies. That's it. This man is Friedrich Nietzsche, and by the account most biographers repeat, though historians are honest that it was only written down 11 years later, secondhand, and is now treated as legend rather than confirmed fact, he collapsed in the street that day and never fully returned to his right mind again. He would live 11 more years. He would not write another word that made sense. The tragedy isn't that Nietzsche went mad. The tragedy is that almost nobody in his entire working life was paying attention while he was still sane. And the reason might be the exact opposite of what you'd expect. Nietzsche wasn't a late bloomer. He was frighteningly early. By 24, he held a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel, one of the youngest people in the university's history to be given that post before he'd even finished his own doctorate. He should have had everything: recognition, colleagues, a stable life inside the very institution built to reward brilliant minds. Instead, the more he studied, the more distance opened up between him and everyone around him. He looked at European culture, its religion, its morality, its comfortable certainties, and saw something most people couldn't or wouldn't let themselves see. That the foundations everyone stood on were cracked. That most truths people lived by weren't discovered, they were invented, out of fear, out of the need to survive, out of the need to belong. In Human, All Too Human, he wrote a line that should unsettle anyone who thinks confidence equals correctness. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Read that again. Not lies, convictions. The things you're most sure of. By 34, his health had collapsed so badly he had to resign the professorship. The man who'd achieved more by 24 than most achieve in a lifetime spent the rest of his life essentially homeless, moving from rented room to rented room across Switzerland, France, and Italy, writing books almost nobody bought, understood by almost nobody. He had more knowledge than nearly anyone alive, and it isolated him completely. Here's where it stops being history and starts being about you. In Beyond Good and Evil, Aphorism 24, Nietzsche made a claim most people never expect from a philosopher obsessed with truth. He wrote about how humanity survives by simplifying the world, giving the senses, in his words, a passport to everything superficial. And then he went further, saying that only on this solidified, granite-like foundation of ignorance could the will to knowledge ever stand at all. He called it the will to ignorance, not the opposite of the will to truth, but its foundation. Total awareness, in other words, doesn't make a mind powerful. It paralyzes it. Think about the people you know who overthink everything, who research every decision into the ground, who see every risk, every flaw, every way it could go wrong. Are they the ones taking the leap? Or are they the ones still standing at the edge, perfectly informed, and still not moving? In an earlier essay, on the use and abuse of history for life, he made the same point even more bluntly. Without forgetting, it is quite impossible to live at all. A mind that carries the full, unfiltered weight of every fact, every wound, every disappointment doesn't become wise, it becomes stuck. And in Daybreak, he framed that selective forgetting as strength, not avoidance. The higher we soar, the smaller we seem to those who cannot fly. This is the weapon, not stupidity, not delusion. A deliberate, chosen selectivity, deciding what not to carry, what not to obsess over, what not to let define you. The difference between a person destroyed by every opinion ever said about them and a person who simply never checks. Here's the twist that makes this more than a quote on a gym poster. Nietzsche diagnosed the cure, and he could not take his own medicine. He never learned to look away from anything. Not the hypocrisy of the institutions around him, not the collapse of his closest friendship with the composer Richard Wagner, not his own failing body, which he catalogued obsessively in letters for over 20 years. By the end of 1888, the most productive year of his life, the year he wrote Twilight of the Idols and Ecce Homo in that same small Turin apartment, the people around him started noticing something breaking. His landlord's family found torn banknotes discarded in his wastebasket. He played the piano for hours, tunelessly. His letters, once precise and cutting, turned into what his own friends called delusion notes, signed not with his name, but with names like Dionysus or the Crucified. His old friend Franz Overbeck rushed to Turin after receiving one of those letters and found him no longer able to return to the man he'd been days earlier. The philosopher who told the world that a little ignorance is what keeps a mind alive spent his own life refusing to look away from anything until there was nothing left to look with. Sit with that. It's not a contradiction, it's a warning. And here's the part almost no one talks about, the part that makes this story darker than a breakdown. While Nietzsche sat silent for the next 11 years, first cared for by his mother, then by his sister Elizabeth, she took control of everything he'd written, including notebooks he never intended to publish. She spliced fragments together into a book she titled The Will to Power and presented it as his masterwork. Historians who later examined her editing found she had forged close to 30 of his letters and rewritten entire passages to fit her own politics. In 1930, she became a supporter of the Nazi Party. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, he visited the Nietzsche archive she controlled and backed it financially. When she died in 1935, Hitler attended her funeral. Nietzsche himself had written against German nationalism and anti-Semitism in his own hand, in his own lifetime. But he wasn't in the room for any of it. He'd been silent for over 40 years by the time it happened, and dead for over 3 decades. For most of the 20th century, the world heard the name Nietzsche and thought of the very ideology he despised. A man who spent his healthiest years teaching people to guard what gets access to their mind, lost control of his own name the moment he could no longer defend it. The same forgetting that might have kept him sane became the silence that let someone else rewrite exactly who he was. You are, right now, more informed than any human in history has ever been. You know what everyone thinks of everything. You know the news the second it happens. You know exactly how you compare to 1,000 strangers you'll never meet. And somehow, with all of that, you feel smaller, not bigger. Nietzsche's answer wasn't to know less about the world. It was to stop needing to know everything about yourself in relation to everyone else. To stop auditing every opinion, replaying every rejection, needing proof before you trust your own instinct. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how, he wrote in Twilight of the Idols. Meaning, purpose doesn't require total information. It requires a decision to move, even inside uncertainty, even inside not knowing. That is the weapon. Choosing, deliberately, what you refuse to carry. Not because you're avoiding truth, because a mind has to be light enough to move, or it never moves at all. Nietzsche died in August 1900, never having seen the world receive the ideas he spent his sanity building. Today, those ideas are some of the most quoted in human history. He couldn't put down the weight. He couldn't even protect his own name once he lost the strength to carry it. Maybe you can do what he couldn't. The next time your mind hands you one more thing to analyze, one more comparison, one more piece of certainty you don't actually need, you get to choose. Carry it, or set it down. That choice was Nietzsche's real secret weapon. He just never got to use it on himself. If this made you see your own mind a little differently, that's exactly what Lone Pride is for. Subscribe. There's more of this coming.